Hello and welcome back. In our previous session, we discovered that in actual fact, Genesis chapters 1 and 2 had an audience that the writer Moses was writing to. The Hebrew people had been chosen by God to be his special people to help get God's creation project back on track. So, in preparation, it was important that they know, firstly, who it was who had chosen them, and secondly, the actual task that God had called them to. Genesis chapters 1 and 2 perfectly answers these two questions as we saw in our previous session. In this session, we will join with biblical personalities in asking the all-important question, what is man that you, Lord, are mindful of him? The Son of Man that you care for him. Psalm 8:4 and Psalm 144 verse 3. King David was not the only person to have ever asked this question in biblical times and have it enshrined in Scripture. Hundreds of years before him, Job had asked the very same question. What is man that you make so much of him and give him so much attention? Job 7:17. Both David and Job seemed more than a little perplexed as to why God indeed shows so much interest in man. And perhaps we all have from time to time pondered that very same question, perhaps in a very personal way. What am I, God, that you are mindful of me and that you care for me? Well, in this session, we will attempt to answer this question, and really, it's not such a difficult question to answer. Created last in a stunning display of God's created genius, man stands preeminent over all other expressions of God's created order. Having been made in God's very own likeness and image sets man apart from all else. Look at man, God was saying to all creation, and you will be seeing me. Well, not physically, of course, as God is spirit, John 4:24. But man was to represent God, his attributes, his nature, his character and purpose, knowledge and wisdom, etc. To represent God's presence in the world and to reflect glory back to God from his world and for all eternity. Initially made a little lower than the angels, Hebrews 2 verse 7, man was always destined to be higher. In fact, to be an heir of God. Paul tells us this in Romans 8:17. In other words, man was to be adopted into the very royal family of God. Paul makes this very clear in Ephesians chapter 1 verses 4 and 5, where he says, in love he predestined us for adoption to sonship. Adoption to sonship is a very important concept. And this is a Roman concept, not a Jewish one, as Jews had no adoption law in their society. At the heart of this Roman law was the desire to be able to add someone to the family from outside the family in order to provide an heir for the family inheritance, to ensure the family's future well-being. Octavian, for example, was adopted by Julius Caesar to be his heir and later became known as Caesar Augustus, and was the first emperor of Rome. In using the adoption metaphor, Paul is making it clear that God's purpose for man was to be God's heir, or more importantly, and as we shall see in later sessions, co-heirs with Christ. Romans 8:17. And it is important to add that this is not primarily for our sakes, as precious as this thought might be, but for his name's sake. Paul says in Ephesians 1:18 that we have become his inheritance. We are God's inheritance. Remember the Roman reason for adoption that Paul is referencing here. The commissioning of Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 1:26-28 was to rule, to be fruitful, to fill the earth and to subdue it, etc. All reflect the purpose of man's elevated royal family calling and adoption. This all means that God created us for work. That is, to work together with him in kingdom endeavors, in royal family business, to live a life on mission with God. Often we hear that the reason why God created us in His likeness and image was for fellowship. Well, that's nice, and while there is truth in this, we cannot separate fellowship with God from working together with God. Sadly, today fellowship is often seen as something resembling a chilling out cafe experience among friends. But this lacks the whole idea of kingdom purpose and of working together with God and seeing His creation project blossom into fullness and glory. The many metaphors that describe our relationship with God does imply relational intimacy, such as father and son, husband and wife, etc. But we need to add to these metaphors other biblical metaphors, such as master and servant, to help us understand just what adoption truly means. And that is to be, of course, an heir with God, ruling and reigning over kingdom purposes. And this is why we were made in God's very own likeness, image, an image in the very first place. And perhaps we should pause a little here to emphasize the point that adoption to sonship was not some plan B resulting from the fall. It is part of God's plan A and always has been from before the world began. As Paul so emphatically states in Ephesians 1 verses 4 to 5, for He chose us before the creation of the world for adoption to sonship. Adoption into the royal family of God has always been our destiny and is the very reason why we were created in God's very own likeness and image, and now why He has redeemed us. So what went wrong? Why didn't Adam and Eve enter into this intimate and purposeful relationship with God, become an heir, inherit royal prestige and glory, and together with God embark on fulfilling His glorious before the world began dream, His creation project, and bring it to fullness and glory? Well, this question we will attempt to answer in our next session. But to give you a hint, let me just say that although Adam was created perfect, he wasn't created complete. In his incompleteness, he was made just a little lower than the angels, Hebrews 2:7. His quest for completeness and participation in God's royal family was always going to be a journey. And this journey we will introduce in our next session. So until then, please spend some time prayerfully pondering this incredible idea that you were made special and for a special purpose to be God's heir. His purpose for you from before the world began was adoption into His royal family, to live a life on mission with God in fulfilling His awe-inspiring dream and for all eternity. So, see you next time, and don't forget to leave a comment. God bless.